Looks like the mic's active. Welcome. I think one of the last but one presentation before lunch, so I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet and keep enough time for questions. The session's about the significance of API standardization. As a lead-in question I dropped in the previous speaking session that was about the corporate banking APIs, about the need for standards, and I'm glad that corporate banking is also looking at standards to make things easier. A little bit about me. I am Dinesh Katyal. I'm a director of product with Avast. I head up their open banking and payments. I was also a co-founder of Financial Data Exchange. I'll tell you more about Financial Data Exchange later in the session. I've spent the last few years curating the open banking standards in the US. A big motivation for me to give this talk was really to convey the progress that we made in the open banking ecosystem in the US, and hopefully get you excited about the potential of standardization. As you think about API strategies, we've talked a lot about the governance. However, a big benefit of the APIs, and particularly an ecosystem, is standardization. Hopefully, I'll get you excited about contributing to the standards as well. So who is Avast? Avast is a world leader in consumer cybersecurity, privacy, digital identity, and trust-based services with over 435 million users worldwide. Avast is also a member of Financial Data Exchange and co-chairs the Money Movement Task Force as well as the Canadian Technical Task Force. Avast also leads open standards in identity. We co-chair the W3C working groups in decentralized identity and verifiable credentials, and are a steering member of Trust Over IP Foundation. All very, very exciting initiatives. If you want to know more about them, please reach out. So let's talk about the need for API standards, right? We've talked about API governance and all of the cool technologies that you're going to hear about today. However, when you look at multi-party ecosystems, and multi-party ecosystems are ecosystems where you have a number of I've been told to stay off the lights there. Multi-party ecosystems are ecosystems where you have a number of parties that engage with each other, data providers, data recipients, such as financial services, telecom, et cetera. Then you have a unique problem space that you're dealing with. For example, as a consumer, when you walk into a bank, into Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Chase, your experience is somewhat similar. I mean, you have a similar looking account opening form. Every bank calls their list of transaction statements and so on. And it's done purposefully because it creates a consistent consumer experience. If a consumer had different experiences every time they went to a different bank, it would be confusing as heck, and it would be a nightmare for the regulators and the policymakers. Guess what? When you look at the APIs that are developed in such ecosystems that are not based on standards, application developers have to deal with a nightmare. Some of the banks, and these are real scenarios, when banks started standing up their APIs, one bank decided they're not going to send out statements. Another bank decided they'll only make 30 days worth of data available. All very well-informed decision in their silos, but really arbitrary decisions when you look at it as ecosystem as a whole. So you take a space like financial services with 14,000 financial institutions and 11,000 fintechs, you're talking about hundreds of millions of point-to-point connections that suffer from these inconsistencies. And a standardization in such a space would allow a firm to build once without reinventing the wheel. So if you're creating an API, you don't need to worry about what an account type is. What should I call checking account? Is that an account category or an account type? You can use the terminology. And if you're a data recipient, you can build once and reuse your implementation multiple times. It makes the resulting solutions secure, performant, and you can make sure that you're meeting your user experience goals versus spending all your money into solving the integration challenges. To take some of the more tangible examples of where industry-led standardization has been extremely powerful, in short-range wired communications with USB and with short-range wireless communications with Bluetooth, there's been thousands of magnitudes improvement in speed and performance and functionality. USB has seen 27,000 times, and that's a massive, massive number increase in speed, while all the while the connectors have become smaller and smaller from the USB-A all the way to USB-C, and more is coming. Bluetooth used to be in less than 5% of the devices in early 2000s. Now I can unlock my hotel door with my phone using Bluetooth, and it's there. There's hardly a device that doesn't have Bluetooth in it. So as we look at the standardization, another question that comes up is the role of policy versus tech. If you're examining what it means to standardize in your ecosystem, often you may have inertia waiting for the government or the policymakers to do something, or you're thinking the government's going to do something about it. However, in our experience, the government or the government-like bodies are best suited to defining the what. Like, what are the policy outcomes they want? The speed on the highway should be 55 miles an hour. Now, how that's delivered, each car maker is going to do it differently. They're going to come with different user experience, different wheelbase, different sets of wheels, et cetera, to deliver that. Well, then drilling in a little more into the aspects of standardization, it's easy to grasp the standardization on the left, which is tech spec, and I'll talk about that. However, there's the governance piece, and I heard a little more about the governance piece within the corporate boundaries, but there's also a governance piece around APIs within ecosystems as well. The technical specifications start off with taxonomy. You have multiple organizations involved, the entire ecosystem. You want to have a consistent way of calling things, and that's kind of where things generally start. And then you define what the user experience goals are. Who are the users, whether they're human users or non-human users, what are their roles in the ecosystem, what are the use cases. And based on that, then you start to define the data model and the API interaction methodologies. Once you have the data model that specifies the different types of data, and you know who the users are, then you can proceed to defining the security profiles. You know you want to protect the sensitive data, or you want to keep delegates out of a certain type of data. You can right-size the security policies, the data and user types. So that's great. Now you have a great standard, but if you want to drive adoption and true great standards have wide adoption, you want to make sure you're addressing the governance aspects, the non-functional attributes, making sure the APIs are actually there. Somebody's stood up a developer portal, but if you really can't access it, or if it's down 50% of the time, that API is really less than useful. Have a reference implementation for the newcomers coming into the ecosystem to know what they should do, what comes first, what comes second. And for the more mature ecosystems, also have a certification program to assess the entities on the quality of their implementation. And then finally, a registry that collects information on all the participants, describes the capabilities, so anyone participating in the ecosystem can figure out who to work with, can discover their capabilities, and shorten their implementation cycle. So that was a lot of theory. Let me talk about a real-life example of how financial data exchange really catalyzed open banking in the US. It's a story that is extremely powerful, and I hope you enjoy it. To start with FTX, for short, Financial Data Exchange as the full name, is the international nonprofit standard-setting body dedicated to unifying the financial industry around a secure, interoperable, and royalty-free standard. And that standard's really solving the problem of secure access to permission data for consumer and small business. It is a very broad-based organization with 206 members and growing. 2/3 of the members are not banks. However, the governing structure is balanced between the FIs and non-FIs to ensure the standards that are being created with an equal weighting to all parts of the ecosystem. Further, the voting mechanism, the community-based development process ensures the small firms have as much of a voice as a big firm. Some of the best ideas come from the fintechs, and we want to make sure that they're not drowned out by the compliance and risk people in the big organizations. So it's deliberately set up to support innovation and progress. All standards bodies are generally successful if they focus on a specific problem, and FDX is no different. The specific problem that FDX was set up to solve was the need for the consumers to share their credentials with third parties in order to access their data, which is an anachronism in this time. In North America alone, there are 100 million credentials that are being shared with the third parties. And for a given financial institution, and this typically gets the risk and compliance officer's attention, almost 30 to 35% of their user base has shared their credentials. That's probably an undercount. And then for the product people among us and the designers among us, and even the technologists, we spend a lot of time designing these beautiful websites. But guess what? Almost half the time, those websites are being used by bots who don't really care about the color of the screen or the user workflow that you've built up. All they're interested in is scraping the data off and pushing it into the app. So I'll talk about the approach that we took and kind of introduce you to some of the principles in financial data sharing. Like I mentioned before, we start with the taxonomy. We created a definition of the different roles and the actors within the system and the different interactions that happen. Data recipients are entities that receive data. They don't have to be fintechs. By and large, they are fintechs, but a bank is generally a large data recipient as well, with online account opening being such a huge use case. FIs are some of the biggest data consumers in the industry. Similarly, data providers don't have to be financial institutions. They generally are, but they could easily be folks like Intuit or Square or Apple that also hold vast amount of consumer data that needs to be shared. And data access platforms make it easy for data providers to communicate with a number of data recipients and vice versa for data recipients to communicate with a wide number of data providers. And the core at the heart of it is the end user that permissions the data from the provider to the recipient. We then invested time in establishing 5 core principles based on which the standards are created: control, access, transparency, traceability, and security, or CATS for short. Control implies the end user should be able to permission their financial data in the financial app of their choice. They are in control. Access means end users should have access to their financial data, and also to be able to determine which entities can access data on their behalf. They should have transparency into how, when, and for what purpose is their data being requested, and that the requested data conforms to the original intent of the request. You're not pulling in more data than you need for your business purpose. All data transfer should be traceable, and users should have visibility into all of the parties involved in the data sharing chain. And finally, entities should ensure the data as it transits from one entity to another is kept secure, and the end user privacy is maintained. We then proceeded to create the user experience guidelines. They describe how the user experience controls access to the financial data, starting with the principle of consent grant. Consent originates at the point of need, which is the application that needs the data. It represents what data it needs and for what purpose. And that consent then moves on to the data provider that reflects the consent. It redisplays the consent. The user has perfect visibility on both sides. And once they authorize, that action is called consent grant. Once the consent is granted, all the related parties, for example, AI joint owners in the account, delegates, et cetera, they get notified that some data is going to be shared out of this account. And at any point in time, and I'll show you some of the dashboards, it's really nice to see some of these principles come to life. They can manage their consent at the banking dashboards. In terms of the API and data standardization, Fdx has taken a two-fold approach to standardization. On the right-hand side, you'll see a comprehensive mapping to all of the financial products. I think Fdx is probably the most complete data model on the open banking side globally, covering checking, savings, credit, investments, insurance, annuities, tax, statements, check images. When you have a data model this large, it's great because you have perfect mapping, but it's also a problem because then not everyone's going to implement 620 data elements. So you end up with, and it's a classic ISO 20 or 22 problem. ISO 2022 is also a very comprehensive data model. The challenge is not everyone implements everything. And how do you know that you can work with someone? So here's the second part of the standardization, which is the certification use cases. The data profiles defined for specific use cases, such as for personal finance, lending, account linking, payments, et cetera. So if that's what you want to do, then as a provider, you know that you want to implement these 200 elements or these 20 elements for this use case. And somebody can just ask you for that specific use case and know that they're going to be able to work with your implementation. A big part of the standards development is making sure we're tracking other standards. There are established standards for security and identity that we borrowed from, and that's most visible in our security stack. We reference TLS, MTLS, OIDC, OAuth 2. In some cases, we've taken existing standards and developed our own profiles. For example, IETF's Dynamic Client Registration Protocol. We created a profile on top of that that's specific to our ecosystem. So here's the complete suite of standards, informed by taxonomy, governance, and community development process. And finally, on the standard side, there is also a need to inform and educate as the regulators move ahead with policy making. We do not advocate. We don't pick winners and losers. We leave that to the policymakers to set policy objectives, but we want to make sure the policies are informed by technology and what's happening out in the industry. So all of that's great. What did we achieve? At this point, we've gone from 2 million consumer accounts in spring of 2019 all the way to 32 million consumer accounts now in 2.5 years. As point of comparison, UK open banking is right about here at about 5 million consumer accounts. In adoption of the UX guidelines, you can see, and you would notice it on your own banking sites as well, that banks are starting to show controls for the end users to manage consent, and to manage the applications that the access has been granted to. Here are some of the known dev portals out there for consumer permission data sharing, and an increasing number of publicly announced and also many more non-public data sharing agreements that are out in the market. So in summary, global industry-led standards have a successful track record. I shared 3 examples with you: Bluetooth, USB, and FDX. The secret to success is inclusivity and a thoughtful approach to standardization. And then finally, just leaving this with you all, and as you look at the applicability to your own ecosystem, as well as your willingness to participate in the financial services, we are available for any reach out that you may want to do. Thank you.
Okay, we got time for a question. Anybody? Okay, Dave, you can just get set up. Actually, I have a question, Dinesh. So the growth curve there is really quite amazing, right? From 2 million to 32 million. Is there a particular reason you think this group has done so well in attracting such a wide audience for standardization? Is there something about the way it's governed or the way the system is designed that makes it so appealing? Because that's a huge audience that you have.
Yeah, I think the secret to that is really how the consortium was constituted. It consists of a set of self-interested bodies who are working towards the goal, and a big part of the getting the momentum was getting the seed group together. Once we had 3 or 4 big banks and 3 or 4 big fintechs starting to make progress, and people started to see the proof points, and it was really a downhill journey from there. The argument's very compelling. It's really
is it a kind of a pay to play? Do you have to subscribe to be part of the consortium, or can any organization participate?
You do not have to pay to play. You can leverage the standards for free. However, if you want to influence the future of the standards and you want to connect to the community, then those are the benefits that you pay for.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, here's a question.
I have a question because I have been working in software, and in software development, we also have all the standard like you just mentioned for API. Maybe you could mention one main difference between the standard for the standard between API and software, or it will be the same in your opinion?
That is a great question. I don't know if I'm really qualified to comment on the software standards, but some of the same issues apply. I mean, the reason, and this may be completely wrong, but the fact that Sun controlled the development of Java means that Apple was forced to come up with their own standard, and Microsoft came up with their own versus, and those implementations are largely based on the same principle, the C#, the Java, and Swift. They're not like tremendously different. If they just collaborated, it would make everyone's life a lot easier.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have to cut it off. I'm sure Dinesh will be available later for some additional questions. Thank you, Dinesh. Thanks.